Welcome to this special live discussion whether a century-old dispute could turn into a hot, violent conflict. Brought to you by DW Business. We'll take a look at the tensions surrounding the Essequibo territory, oil-rich and under Guyanese rule, with neighbor Venezuela voicing loud and increasingly aggressive claims of the land. To help us unpack this issue, I'm joined by DW correspondent Oscar Schlenker in Caracas. Welcome, Oscar. And if you have any questions about this dispute, its origins and what it could turn into, just post them in the chat, and that way these questions may find their way into the show. Let's get started. Oscar, tensions have been rising between Venezuela and Guyana. How serious is this situation?
Well, it's become a lot more serious in the last few months because we've seen that the Venezuelan government has enacted a referendum in order for the Venezuelans to vote and say if they want the Venezuelan government to take action into annexing and claiming this territory, which has been in dispute for over 100 years. And that referendum is they can use that as an excuse in international court to show support for the Maduro regime and his administration to act upon taking actions against Guyana.
Oscar, we'll dive into the subject here in a second. Let's take a look at the region at the heart of this dispute. Venezuela is now claiming Guyana's territory west of the Essequibo River. It's also laying claim to the vast majority of Guyana's territorial waters and its oil fields up to the mouth of the river and the capital, Georgetown. Venezuela already has the world's largest proven oil reserves. Oscar, this dispute is about an oil-rich territory. How does Venezuela get involved here?
Well, Guyana was part of Venezuela when it was liberated by Simón Bolívar more than 100 years ago. And then in an arbitral document, Britain simply annexed it to Guyana, and it's been in dispute since 1899. So, you know, during those years, this was just a jungle territory. It's just a part of the Amazon rainforest, and it's all mostly a dense tropical rainforest, what we find there. So there wasn't really a lot of action taken into annexing this territory, even though it was being reclaimed and disputed in different international courts throughout the years. But it wasn't until they discovered gas and oil reserves in 2015 that the situation became a lot more interesting for the different governments to start acting on this dispute a lot more vigorously, let's say. And since then, Guyana's government has allowed different international companies like ExxonMobil and other companies to start extracting and enacting contracts to start enacting explorations and extractions of this territory.
Oscar, we already have questions coming in here from our users. Before we get to those, just briefly, this dispute reaches back into the 19th century. You mentioned it there. But even Cuban leader Fidel Castro told his protege, the late Hugo Chavez, then president of Venezuela around the start of the century, to put this matter to rest. Why has this issue reignited now?
Well, basically, it's because of the gas and oil reserves that we've seen in 2015. This exploration has arisen. Chavez died in 2013. So since when Chavez was president, he needed Guyana's support for his geopolitical agenda in the region. And Guyana was a very important member of Petrocaribe, which was one of these programs that Chavez had created in order to gain political support in the region from all the Caribbean, and in the exchange of oil, which Venezuela already has the largest oil reserves in the world. So in that sense, Chavez was more interested in gaining the political support of Guyana than in furthering the dispute of this territory, which when he was alive was just a dense, very dense tropical jungle with very little to give economically to Venezuela at that point. But once Guyana found in different explorations gas and oil reserves that were quite a bit for them, and started giving contracts to these international companies, that's when Venezuela began to really notice the potential of this region, and well, they started furthering this dispute.
Right, and Oscar, I think we're going to talk about oil some more in the upcoming minutes here. First, let me ask you a question that Matthew posted. What are the chances Venezuela actually sends troops into Guyana and this dispute will spiral into a regional conflict? I mean, tensions have been rising recently.
Well, tensions are rising. That's a fear that everybody has. I don't believe there is an interest in igniting the region. We've heard President Lula da Silva, Brazil's president, said that he wants to resolve this conflict peacefully, and it's an important process for Brazil to step up as a global and regional leader as well, because they are also a bordering country. And I'm sure that nobody wants another conflict in the world right now, but there are certainly threats of that becoming one. Now, Venezuela has the upper hand in military force against Guyana, but Guyana has much more powerful allies like the U.S. and Britain. What many people are saying is that this is a repetition or something that we've seen before in South America with the Falkland Islands, and how that became a conflict between Argentina and Britain for that 72-day war between these two countries that ended up in Argentina losing the Falkland Islands, and that dispute was settled forcefully, but it was settled. Now, we don't know what will happen. The Venezuelan government and Maduro's administration is unfortunately very unpredictable. And as journalists here in Venezuela, it is hard to say sometimes what will happen, because we don't know until the moment that it's happening.
You mentioned there, Oscar, that militarily Venezuela would have the upper hand. Guyana, for its part, would have the stronger allies. Let's take a look at Guyana here for a second, because Michael Marks is asking, how united are the people of Guyana in defense of their homeland?
Well, that's a tricky question, because the people in the Essequibo region, the territory that's being disputed, most of the people that live in that region are indigenous people. And they feel like they've been ignored by Guyana's government and also by Venezuela's government for years now. And it is unfortunate that this dispute is mostly based on the extraction of its natural resources rather than the attention of the people that live in this region. And it's a dispute that has risen the voice of these indigenous people living in this area. And it's also unfortunate that it's probably those people that will be most vulnerable if there is an armed conflict, which we are all trying to avoid.
Oscar, you mentioned the referendum which the Venezuelan government held last weekend, and in which 95% of voters supposedly supported declaring Venezuela the region's rightful owner. What are we to make of this referendum?
Well, the referendum, as we saw it here, had very little interest by people. We didn't see a lot of people going to the voting centers and voting for this referendum. However, the people that did go to vote obviously voted in favor, because most of the people that felt a need to participate in this referendum are people who support Maduro's administration or work in public office or receive some kind of government benefit. We have seen reports of government benefits being threatened to people that don't go and support their electoral votes or elections. So, it's a very tricky question, because the government claims that over 10 million people voted, and it's a hard claim to make from a journalistic point of view, because we saw the voting centers. We received the information from different agencies, from our colleagues covering the referendum and in the streets, from social media showing the different polling centers with little to no people gathered and voting. So, but there is no doubt that whoever did vote, which some people went to vote, of course, voted in favor of annexing the Essequibo territory. And this is a dispute that is really close to everybody's heart in Venezuela. Opposition or supporters of the government both say that is Venezuela's territory, just as Guyanese people say that that is their territory. So it is a very complex dispute, because both countries really do claim it.
Oscar, in response to this referendum, the United States will hold joint military exercises with Guyana as a show of support for its territorial integrity. Here's what the U.S. National Security spokesman John Kirby says about the issue.
We support the peaceful resolution of the border dispute between Venezuela and Guyana, and we absolutely stand by our unwavering support for Guyana's sovereignty. The 1899 arbitral award that determined the land boundary between those two countries should be respected unless or until the parties themselves reach a new agreement or a competent legal body decides otherwise, and that hadn't happened. So we're going to urge Venezuela and Guyana to continue to seek a peaceful resolution of this dispute, including by the International Court of Justice.
Oscar, let's talk about that. Guyana has asked the United Nations top court, the International Court of Justice, to rule that the initial land accord is legal. Now, Guyana did so in 2008. Why is there no verdict so far?
Yeah, in 2018. Yeah, well, it's a dispute that Venezuela has a good claim on, because and there was a 1966. There was a memorandum led to complaints by Venezuela to the United Nations, which resulted in a Geneva Agreement signed in the United Kingdom in 1966. And that memorandum says that the status is subject to the Geneva Agreement. And Venezuela and the British Guyana, and that was right before. So the British and Venezuela signed an agreement that the dispute was going to be settled in court, because Venezuela had a good claim to it. But it was just a few months before Guyana did their got separated from the British at that point. So their independence, they received their independence shortly after that agreement. And that's when the international courts really stopped trying to deal with this dispute. So there is a legitimate dispute and a legitimate claim from Venezuela on this territory. However, it's been controlled by Guyana for the past century.
And Oscar, when Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is claiming that Essequibo is to become a fully fledged state of Venezuela, although Guyana is still controlling the territory, what does that mean then?
Well, they want to stop all the gas and oil explorations and contracts that Guyana has made with different international companies, and they also want to um, um, uh, give identification to all the people living in that territory. Those are the main two actions that they are claiming to do in order to claim this territory, this disputed territory. Aside from that, they've really increased their military presence in the border between the Guyana, Essequibo, and Venezuela in the Bolivar state and in Del Tamacuro. And they've made Tumeremo, which is a city close to the border, as operations center for getting this territory annexed into another full-fledged state of Venezuela. The other thing they have done since I can remember, we've had our map of Venezuela with that region striped out with stripes, saying that it was a reclaimed territory, and now they are issuing new maps with that region annexed as a full-fledged state. So those are the actions that they are taking at the moment in order to claim the territory.
So this dispute obviously has not turned into a hot conflict so far, yet it is the danger of that happening that is on the minds of our viewers here. We have Angel Esquera asking, have the Venezuelan military made preparations needed should it come down to war with Guyana? What can you tell us about that, Oscar?
Well, both governments have been showing their teeth, sort of say. They've increased military presence in the border. There is a military operation going on to claim the Essequibo, gathering troops in that border. However, that is just about it. There haven't been any other actions taken in order to begin any kind of a conflict or armed conflict. We do know that days before the referendum in Venezuela, the Guyanese president went to the region and camped out a night with their troops, and it's all pretty much political at this point. It's a political game where they are showing that they are increasing the military presence, but as of yet, we haven't seen any action of military dispute at this point, and we hope we don't see it in the coming months either.
Oscar, we've seen action on a different front, though. Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, has said that foreign companies in the contested area have 3 months to vacate. Simultaneously, the Venezuelan government will offer exploration and exploitation licenses to other companies. Would they even be valid?
Yeah, that's a good question. As I said before, this is very unpredictable sometimes. There's a lot of things said that we just have to see how they're going to accomplish those threats, because those are threats to foreign companies. Now, we do know that a lot of these companies, they do have operations in Venezuela, or they want to come to Venezuela, but they haven't been able to because of the U.S. sanctions and European sanctions against Venezuela at the moment. Mostly the U.S. sanctions is what mostly affects it. But for example, ExxonMobil, which is one of the biggest oil companies working in this region, even though they do have some presence and some operations in Venezuela that they are allowed to do despite the sanctions, they pretty much are also doing the exploration in the Essequibo territory. So it is it is a political threat to do this, and also to, in a way, defy these sanctions that are being imposed against Venezuela. To say, look, we're going to take over this territory, and the companies that are doing exploration there that can't do so in Venezuela because of the sanctions will have to figure something out, or pressure the countries where they're from to lift those sanctions so that they can explore the whole region. So it's also a way to contest these sanctions that are being imposed against Venezuela.
Let me just remind our viewers here that if you have any questions about these rising tensions between Guyana and Venezuela, post them in the chat so that they may find their way into the show. One viewer, Oscar, has been asking, would Venezuela get enough benefits against the cost to make it worth annexing the Essequibo region?
That's a very good question. For example, we've seen in the past few months that Venezuela has had trouble with their identification office, the SIME, the office that actually emits ID cards and passports and all these documents to Venezuelans. We know we have, because of all the different crises that we live in Venezuela, we have the largest migration of people in history in the region. Over 8 million Venezuelans have left the country, and all these Venezuelans need passports, need IDs to be legal in the countries where they are migrating to. So we have a huge problem with issuing these IDs and these passports, and especially with Indigenous people, because they have a bit of a harder time getting those passports and those IDs as Indigenous people identified. So it's very ironic that that's one of the first things they want to do, is that they want to ID the people in this Essequibo territory, which seems like a stretch when it's so difficult for the people that are already living in Venezuela to do so. So obviously the cost of doing that, well, it's a hard sell for us to believe it. However, you know, the Venezuelan government has been capable in the past of doing good on their word. So that's why I say it's very unpredictable what could happen.
So President Maduro of Venezuela has held a referendum, a public referendum, whether the Essequibo region should be annexed. He has told foreign companies basically to get out, and he's been giving out exploration and exploitation rights, or wants to do that at least, to other companies. Now, Guyana's Vice President, Parajagdeo, has been responding to what the Venezuelan side has been doing. Take a listen.
Any attempt to explore for petroleum by his state oil companies or state companies in our territory will be seen as an incursion by Guyana. And I want to say to the companies that he is given an ultimatum to. They should pay no regard to Maduro or his ultimatum. We will defend that territory as sovereign Guyanese territory. Venezuela is not going to succeed, now or ever.
Oscar, back to you in Caracas. Is it just about the oil that both sides are at loggerheads here?
Well, yes, definitely. I mean, both governments have said so. It's about the oil, and that's what's most unfortunate about this dispute. It's not about the people. It's not about the indigenous people there. It's not about trying to preserve this natural, this dense rainforest, because they've had all these years since 1966, which was the last international court dispute on this territory. to resolve this disputed area, and they haven't really cared or come to an agreement until in 2015, we heard the news of this great discovery of huge oil and gas reserves in this area. And now we also have seen that that's not the only thing that you can exploit from this territory. There's also a lot of minerals, gold, all kinds of different things that are being exploited or could be exploited from these rainforests. That's we have seen in Venezuela that there is a huge problem with illegal mining that is affecting all the indigenous communities in Venezuela, and there's nothing being done about it. We are seeing ecological disasters happening all the time now because of this illegal mining and this just ravenous thirst for extracting minerals from the rainforest. A lot of people don't realize that Venezuela is an Amazonic country. We have the door to the Amazon is in Venezuela. The south of Venezuela is all Amazon rainforest, and there's little to no attention being paid to how that affects the rest of the Amazon rainforest and how that's the extraction of minerals and other natural resources there is affecting this vast rainforest as well.
Oscar, what many people may know is that Venezuela has a lot of natural resources, gas reserves, oil reserves. Let's talk about Guyana, though. These findings, these reserves that were found in recent years in Guyana, what would exploiting them mean to the country?
Well, it's definitely when that discovery came about, and we all reported in different news outlets how this would change the country. Guyana is a poor country. It doesn't have a large population, and most of it is gathered in Georgetown, which is a small city. So this means a huge advance for the country. And as soon as that discovery of resources came about, they started handing out these contracts for foreign companies to start exploiting it. So obviously it would be an impressive change for the country to the better in terms of how economically they would grow.
Oscar, we have more questions coming in here. Harold Crucify wants to ask, is there any evidence of malfeasance in the arbitration that awarded the Essequibo territory to England? What can you tell us about that?
Excuse me, what was the word that you said, malfeasance?
Is there any evidence of malfeasance in the arbitration that awarded the territory to England?
Actually, in that term, I am not an expert. I am not an expert in this law and arbitration between the international courts. I'm afraid there wouldn't be any reason to dispute Venezuela's claim, but the reality is that Guyana has been in control of the area for more than a century. So that is also something that the international courts are seeing into in order to make a decision on how they will take this dispute further into the international courts.
Oscar, these tensions come at a crucial point for Venezuela. The government is in the process of regaining recognition from the United States and its allies. Sanctions are being progressively lifted, and Western corporations and oil traders are trickling back onto the Venezuelan market. Why would President Maduro stoke a conflict that could send him back majorly on the international stage?
Well, definitely it could set him back. At the same time, he is confident that he also has powerful allies like Russia and China backing him into this dispute, and that would also exploration contracts with this territory. However, it's also a way for him to kind of do a diagnosis of how the political situation is in Venezuela, how much support he has. That referendum, more than a dispute of a territory, was an internal measure of how his support is lying, which we could see in the polling stations. There is not much. However, the government is saying that they did get a vast majority of people voting. We have presidential elections next year, and this is a way to also prepare the electoral council which was recently changed by the government, mostly with people that support the government, to see how an election works, which polling centers have more support, which have less, where they have to go next year and do more campaigning for Venezuela's cause or for Maduro's administration. So I think that the referendum and most of this dispute is also part of an internal diagnosis of how Maduro can act next year, and also to start imprisoning and persecuting opposition politicians that are uncomfortable to the Maduro's administration, which has already began. Because last week, we could see that some of the opposition leaders were imprisoned by the Venezuelan government, claiming that they were claiming treason against the government for doing observations on this referendum that has arisen a lot of more questions than answers.
Oscar, let's talk briefly here about U.S. sanctions that Venezuela has been faced with. Raul Acosta wants to know whether these are legal or justified.
The U.S. has been sanctioning the Venezuelan government since Barack Obama was president. It started with individual sanctions to people that were involved in Maduro's administration, people that are being investigated for crimes against humanity by the UN and the United Nations Human Rights Office. So, yes, these sanctions became more broad and directed towards the Venezuelan companies during Trump's administration, and those sanctions, well, they were legal in terms of the U.S. Legal status. Now, if they are justified, well, a lot of people say they are justified because of that, of those sanctions, the Venezuelan government started lifting a lot of bans and different kinds of techniques to limit the Venezuelan economy. And that's why we've seen a slight growth in our economy, because they started allowing more people to import and export things, given that the sanctions had such a big impact on our economy. But a lot of people are saying also that they are unjustified because they haven't been able to grow the national industry, which is oil and gas and different minerals, because of these sanctions. So the Maduro's administration is claiming that because of these sanctions, we're having a food crisis and an economic crisis and a humanitarian crisis. They're blaming the sanctions. However, journalists that work here, people that live here, are quite aware that these humanitarian crisis was ongoing way before these sanctions came into action, these broader sanctions. The individual sanctions, yes, they've been on for a while now, and it hasn't stopped the Maduro's administration from their operations. That is very questionable to other governments.
Oscar, our viewer Paulie wants to know, who are Venezuela's allies in South America who are supporting this referendum? Can you tell us about that?
Sure, we have Nicaragua's Ortega is a very close ally. Obviously, Cuba is a close ally of Venezuela. Recently, we've seen some, not allies, but they are a little bit more open to discussing with Maduro. Is Colombia's Gustavo Petro and Brazil's Lula da Silva are closer to Venezuela's government than the presidents that were before Petro and Lula. Well, Lula has always been a supporter, which is a tricky situation now because Maduro's administration gets a lot of criticism, even from the left in Latin America, like Boric in Chile, who was a self-proclaimed leftist president, but he also has criticized Maduro's administration for how they've been governing the country. And also Bolivia. Bolivia tends to lean towards supporting Nicolas Maduro because of the whole influence of Evo Morales has over the government.
And I think the Brazilian president, Lula da Silva, could play a pivotal role in this dispute going forward. But first, Oscar, Venezuela has an ally in Russia, and the Kremlin has been quite interested in breaking up the rule-based order in recent months. How likely is it that Russia is pushing Venezuela to cause trouble in the region?
Well, we don't know. We don't know because there is not a lot of information about that, which raises a lot of questions. Why isn't Putin talking about their operations in Venezuela? It's because they're pretty much secure in how Venezuela stands with Russia. There have been military operations and exercises here in Venezuela from the Russian government, and there is a close a friendship between both governments. So it is something to worry about for the people that live here.
Oscar, now there are talks to be held this week between Guyana and Venezuela about the Essequibo question. Now it says that Brazil and other countries of the region needed to put pressure on Guyana to agree to these talks. Why is that?
Well, mostly Guyana believes they have a better claim to the territory than Venezuela because they already control it. And they have the support of powerful nations like the U.S. and Britain, especially in the international courts. They've also had support from the international courts. The International Court of Justice made a claim to Venezuela not to interfere with the actual standing of the control of the territory, and they said that the referendum would not be something binding towards annexing that territory. So Guyana really feels they have the upper hand in claiming the territory and having the courts rule in favor of them. So they really don't have much to discuss except just wait and see what the Venezuelan government would do and how strong are their allies in defending this territory, even though Venezuela starts to move militarily.
And let me remind our viewers, if you have any questions about the dispute between Guyana and Venezuela and the oil-rich Essequibo region, just post them in the chat. That way they may find their way into our conversation here with Oscar Schlenker, our correspondent in Caracas. Oscar, we touched briefly on these talks that are supposed to be held this week between the governments of Guyana and Venezuela, and you don't seem very optimistic that these negotiations will yield any results then.
Well, it's a very complex issue. I am not optimistic because I feel that the people of the region are not being put in first place. I think the indigenous people of that territory are the real owners of that territory, and they're the most vulnerable. I don't think Guyana or Venezuela has really stepped up into giving the attention to these people that they need. I think the indigenous communities both in Venezuela and Guyana are ignored, and they need more rights to be defended. And I just feel it's just very unfortunate that this discussion has to be in terms of extraction of natural resources rather than disputing the legality and the attention and the rights of these indigenous people that deserve to be paid attention to.
Brazil's President Lula da Silva will be present at these negotiations later this week. What role is he playing in this dispute?
Well, I hope he plays a peaceful role in the dispute. We have seen in recent months, and we must applaud that the indigenous people in Brazil have been successful in gaining rights to their lands. And that's been under Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva's presidency, that he has made that available to the indigenous people. I hope that he takes that example also to these negotiations and puts in front the rights of the indigenous people before the discussion of who gets the oil and who gets to extract the oil, and because that is going to affect the people living there.
And of course, Lula da Silva has urged his Venezuelan counterpart, President Maduro, against taking what he calls unilateral measures. Oscar, tell us again, would Nicolas Maduro really invade Guyana?
Well, it is unlikely, but because of what that would imply. If there is military action against Guyana, that could ignite the whole region. And we do not need another war right now going on in the world. I think that Venezuelan people do not have the energy or the stamina to withhold a long war, even though we do have the upper hand militarily against Guyana. It wouldn't be a contest if the allies would come and support Guyana in a military uprising. So I really doubt that would be the move they would take, unless there is some kind of which would be very scary if other countries that support Venezuela would step in. The real losers here are the people on the ground in terms of military losses.
And Oscar, you mentioned obviously that the discussion revolves a lot around the natural resources in the ground, the oil there in the Essequibo territory. But of course, you also said it is about the fate of the people living there, mostly indigenous people. And we have one viewer saying that some time ago there was an indigenous group that raised the Venezuelan flag inside named territory. What is your take on that?
Yes, this was shortly before or after the referendum. In this week's, a group of indigenous people took down the Essequibo flag, the Guyanas flag, and rose the Venezuelan flag. I think that is a desperate act of people wanting to be paid attention to. It's a call out to the Guyana government to pay attention to the indigenous people, and it's also a call out to the Venezuelan government to say, look, we're willing to get whatever we can from this dispute, but pay attention to us. So I think it was an act to, get people to notice them, and I think it worked.
Oscar, we have Yasser Miniram asking, he has a question here. He wants to know if you have any updates on that helicopter that went down. Guyana is blaming Venezuela and Venezuela is denying it, but President Maduro says fire will come to those who oppose adding fuel to rhetoric.
Well, as I said, this is a very dense jungle. And once these military operations increase in the border, it is. I don't have any updates on whether it's been found or not, but it was very worrisome to hear that this helicopter disappeared in that territory. One of Guyana's helicopters disappeared with, I think it was 7 people aboard, and I haven't heard any updates on that situation, but it is very worrisome. I doubt that if it was closer to to Guyana than Venezuela, I doubt that Venezuela had anything to do with it. But as I said, it's very unpredictable sometimes what could happen. So it's definitely something to keep an eye out.
Oscar, we have another question here by Stephen Malari. He's asking, is it true that Venezuelan troops would have to pass through parts of Brazil due to the terrain along its own border? And is that the main reason Brazil has moved troops there?
Well, yeah, definitely. There is a section of the Essequibo territory that there is a dense jungle also through Brazil. Now, I don't know how that would go along in terms of a military takeover. The section of the territory that is adhered to Venezuela is heavily militarized at this point, and the most southern part of the region is the part that is furthest from Georgetown, and it's the section that Venezuela would have much more closer access to as well.
Oscar, I want to talk briefly about the oil industry here, because as we've discussed, natural resources are the main prize here for both sides who are eyeing this territory. We know that Venezuela has vast oil reserves, yet the oil industry in Venezuela has plummeted. Tell us why.
Well, it's a combination of things. The oil industry here was nationalized in the 70s, so it's a national oil industry. And once Chavez came into power, he used PDVSA as a tool to put into action many, if not all, of the social programs that won him a lot of popularity, not only in Venezuela, but also in the geopolitical international spectrum, getting a lot of allies. We gave oil to many countries in exchange for housing contracts, for agricultural projects, for military intelligence exchanges. We still give some of our oil to Cuba. So those are things that started making our oil industry much weaker, to the point where we used to produce more than 4 million barrels a day of oil. And I think that right now we're barely making it to 1 million. So it's really plummeted the production of oil. There hasn't been a lot of investments made into the maintenance of our oil industry. We have a lot of refineries and just drills that are not in operation, and the ones that are at minimal capacity. So that in terms of production has weakened the oil industry here. We still have the largest oil reserves in the world, but our crude is very crude. It's very, it needs a lot of processing in order to make gasoline or other products. And for that, we need to export it to countries that have better refineries. And that's expensive as well. So, and one of our biggest clients or commercial partners was the U.S. And after the sanctions, it became obviously a lot more difficult to get all that crude out into other refineries to process it. So that has also weakened our oil industry.
Oscar, we have another question. Ross32 is asking, since Suriname also has a territorial dispute with Guyana, do you think they'd also step in if Venezuela was to reclaim Essequibo?
Well, I mean, it definitely wouldn't hurt to revive that dispute, seeing that Guyana is already in one. However, if Guyana does win over this territory in international courts, well, we would see what would happen to that dispute with Suriname. We have seen that the Essequibo territory occupies more than 2/3 of Guyana already. Most of it, as I said, is a dense jungle. But it is a vast majority of the territory, not only the land, but also the sea around Guyana is being disputed by Venezuela as well. So if Suriname and Venezuela both, in theory, would win their claims to the territory, I suppose Guyana would be just left with Georgetown. I mean, it's just a small country in South America that unfortunately, a lot of people don't pay a lot of attention to. Either Guyana, Suriname, or French Guyana are three countries that not a lot of people really look at when they see South America. And they are very important countries.
But I think we've been trying to put this matter more into public focus here. Oscar, as we are slowly wrapping up, I mean, there is a lot at stake here for Guyana and for Venezuela. There will be talks this week. You say you're only mildly optimistic that something will come of those talks. I know predictions are hard to make, but if we look at the immediate future and see the tensions that have been rising on both sides, what do you think this dispute will look like in the weeks to come?
Well, there's something to understand about, I've been covering Venezuela from Venezuela for the past 15 years for Deutsche Welle, and what I've seen as a journalist here is that the Venezuelan government thrives on chaos. Chaos fuels Maduro's administration because they always come out quite well after a chaotic episode. And that's why one of the reasons why they managed to stay in power for so long, first with Chavez and now with Nicolas Maduro. I think this was an attempt to maintain the power and control of Venezuela in itself. It's mostly an internal conflict, what we are facing, that has seeped into an international dispute just because that, well, puts an eye and puts a focus on Venezuela again, which was, you know, kind of being ignored in the international spectrum because of the wars we've had in Ukraine and in the Middle East with conflicts rising. A way to regain some sort of platform for political gains was to, restart some kind of international conflict, and that's what we're seeing now happening in with this dispute. Now, it has to do with a lot of factors. I think you said it well when you said that it is a pivotal point to see what Lula da Silva and Brazil, what role he will play in this mediation, and also to see what Guyana does and the president in Guyana, how he will act and respond to Venezuela as well. However, how we can see this conflict escalate, I don't want to predict some kind of military invasion. I don't think that would be something wise for either country to explore, but definitely raise the bar, raise their voices in international courts, in the media as well, just to see how people will respond and take action in terms of what options they have after all that is said and done.
And we will certainly keep an eye on these developments. DW correspondent Oscar Schlenker in Caracas. Oscar, thank you very much for your insights. And that's all from this DW Business Look at the tensions between Venezuela and Guyana. Thanks for watching. Thanks for asking questions. There's plenty more from us here on the DW News YouTube channel. I'm Chris Colburn in Berlin. See you soon.